Lisa and Daniel are at the final boss. They're facing their final challenge. After the indignity of seeking blessings from the uncle, the Lion King, and then the uncle again, Lisa now needs her sins cleansed.
Daniel is spending my money like it's water. He spent $10,000 on 2 yams, and I still have to buy goat. I feel like we were ripped off. I don't think Daniel's a good negotiator. Ever and ever.
No man, no woman.
No man, no woman.
Put asunder.
Put us under.
That is what I promise.
That is what I promise.
Kiss it. Give it to me. It's totally sacrilege. In Africa, any woman that committed an abomination, there is something we call sacrilege.
Lisa walked out of that ceremony looking relieved. And that is the part that should bother you most, because relief usually comes after safety, after clarity, after something good finally happens, but this time, relief came after she handed over money she could not afford, sat through fear she did, not understand, accepted judgment from strangers, and let other people define what was wrong with her in the first place. So the first question is not whether the ritual worked, the first question is how someone ends up feeling saved by the same process that slowly broke their resistance. Was this love being tested, or was this pressure dressed up so neatly as fate that saying no started to feel more dangerous than surrender? Was Lisa fighting for her future, or was she being trained to confuse humiliation with devotion? And once a person starts calling that feeling love, the rest of the story gets a lot darker. Welcome back, this is TLC Drama Live, where we get into the mess, the motives, and the moments people wish viewers would not look at too closely. So if you are into sharp reality TV breakdowns with zero fluff, subscribe and drop a comment telling me this. At what point does sacrifice stop looking romantic and start looking like a warning sign? Because on the surface, this ending looks like a win. Lisa is smiling, Daniel is smiling, the ritual is over, the relationship is back on track, and the future she was terrified of losing suddenly looks available again. But the more you sit with it, the uglier it gets, because she did not walk out of that place with more power she walked out with, less, and somehow she still looked grateful for the privilege. That is not a small contradiction. That is the whole story hiding in plain sight. You do not get to a moment like that overnight. People do not hand over dignity in one dramatic burst and call it peace. They get nudged there step by step, through pressure, through fear, through hope, through the little lies they tell themselves so the bigger lie still feels survivable. And Lisa looked like someone who had reached that point. Not calm, not grounded, not secure, relieved. There is a difference. Relief is what happens when a threat seems to pass. Relief is what you feel when the room finally stops tightening around your chest. Relief is what happens when you think the punishment is over. So when she comes out of this ordeal feeling thankful instead of angry, it tells you something blunt. She had been put under enough emotional pressure that simple survival started to feel like a gift. That is why this opening lands so hard. It is not about whether the priest said she was cleansed, it is about why she needed his approval badly enough to sit through everything that came before it. In my opinion, that is where people miss the real story. They get distracted by the ritual itself, by the spectacle, by the unusual details, by the shock value, by the goat, by the money, by the strict rules, by the drama of it all. And sure, those details matter, but not as much as the emotional pattern underneath them. Because the deeper issue is not that Lisa went through something strange. The deeper issue is that by the end, she seemed willing to call the whole experience necessary. That is where things turn from bizarre to revealing. Once a person starts defending the process that humiliated them, you are no longer watching a weird one-off moment. You are watching a relationship dynamic expose itself. And no, this is not about mocking belief, mocking culture, or flattening everything into one cheap punchline, because that would be lazy and frankly useless. The sharper question is who had power here? Who was setting the terms? Who was paying the cost? Who was absorbing the shame? And who got to walk away with the biggest reward? Lisa paid in emotion, in money, in pride, in compliance. Daniel got the relationship back on safe ground. Everybody around the ritual got obedient. And Lisa, the person under the most pressure, got the comfort of hearing that she had done enough to keep the man she was terrified of losing. That does not feel like balance. That feels like a deal where one side is so scared of the alternative that any outcome short of total collapse starts to look like mercy. That is why the ending is more unsettling than the chaos in the middle. By the time she leaves, the process has already done its work. She is no longer standing outside it asking whether any of this makes sense. She is standing inside it, emotionally invested in the result, desperate for approval, and almost thankful for the chance to keep going. That shift matters, because people do not reach that state unless they have already accepted things they once would have pushed back on. By the time she sat in front of that priest, by the time she handed over control, by the time she was waiting for someone else to decide whether her future still existed, Lisa had already crossed lines most people would stop at without thinking twice, and the wild part is, the priest was not even. The beginning got to understand how Lisa ended up walking out of that ceremony looking relieved. You have to go back to the moment this stopped being a relationship problem and started becoming a system. Because once the ritual entered the story, Lisa was no longer dealing with one man and one messy romance. She was dealing with a chain of authority where every new voice made her position weaker, and every step forward made backing out feel harder. That is what makes this setup so uncomfortable. It was not presented as a conversation between equals, it was presented as a path already decided by other people, and Lisa was simply being moved through it. The first move came through Daniel's uncle. And that detail matters more than it seems, because the uncle does not function like a random relative giving casual advice. He becomes the bridge between the couple's private conflict and a wider network of approval. Once he steps in, the relationship is no longer framed as something Lisa and Daniel can sort out between themselves. Now it belongs to the family, then to elders, then to spiritual authority, then to whatever the oracle is said to demand. With each layer, Lisa gets further away from a normal emotional conversation and closer to a structure where other people get to define what her problem is, what the fix is, and what price she has to pay to stay in the relationship. And that is the trap forming in real time. Because every time another authority figure gets added, the situation starts looking less like a choice and more like a verdict. The uncle talks to the elders. The elders connect to the chief priest. The chief priest speaks for the oracle. The oracle identifies the offense. Then, the answer comes back down the ladder with the full weight of tradition, family expectation, and spiritual pressure attached to it. By the time the message reaches Lisa, it no longer sounds like one opinion among many. It sounds final. It sounds official. It sounds like saying no would mean rejecting not one person, but an entire belief structure wrapped around Daniel's world. That is why this part of the story is so much more than setup. This is where the emotional balance gets destroyed. Daniel has access to the system. His uncle understands the language of it. The elders belong to it. The priest holds power inside it. Even the oracle, whether one believes in that process or not, gets presented as the highest voice in the room. Lisa stands outside all of that. She does not control the rules. She does not shape the meaning. She does not even seem fully informed at each step. She is the one person in the chain with the least power, yet she is the one expected to prove the most. That is not a small disadvantage. That is the whole engine. And this is where the question of pressure starts to replace the question of love. Because if this were only about two people trying to make a relationship work across differences, the focus would be on understanding, compromise, clarity, and mutual respect. Instead, what Lisa gets is a message from above. There's been a conversation among the people who matter. A decision has been made. A cleansing is required. That is not framed like an invitation. It lands like an order. The emotional effect is brutal, because once the problem is described in those terms, Lisa is no longer arguing with Daniel about what feels fair. She is staring at a structure that suggests her future depends on cooperation. And cooperation here does not mean understanding. It means compliance. That is the ugliest part. Lisa's role gets reduced fast. She is not there to negotiate the terms, challenge the premise, or slow the process down until she feels grounded. Her role is to go along, trust the chain of authority, and do what she is told. Everyone else gets a speaking part. The uncle interprets. The elders approve. The priest declares. The oracle reveals. Lisa obeys. Once you notice that pattern, the whole thing feels less like a ritual of healing and more like a funnel. Every voice narrows her options. Every layer makes resistance feel more expensive. In my opinion, the psychology of this is what makes the story hit so hard. Because pressure works best when it does not arrive as one giant threat. Pressure works best when it comes dressed as process. First, you hear that there is a problem. Then you hear other people are involved. Then you hear there is a solution. Then you hear the solution comes with condition. Then suddenly you are no longer deciding whether this makes sense. You are trying not to be the person who ruins everything by refusing. That is the position Lisa gets pushed into. And once someone is scared enough of losing the relationship, even absurd demands start to feel like steps towards safety. The cruel genius of the setup is that every authority in the chain gives the next one more legitimacy. If the uncle says it, Lisa might doubt it. If the elders agree, the pressure grows. If the priest confirms it, the fear gets heavier. If the oracle is invoked, now the whole thing starts sounding untouchable. So the system keeps borrowing weight from itself until Lisa is standing in front of a solution that looks too dangerous to reject. And the more official the process sounds, the easier it becomes for everyone around her to treat her surrender as reasonable. By this point, the relationship is no longer being sold as a bond between two people. It is being filtered through approval, correction, and ritual permission. That changes everything. Love starts looking conditional. Acceptance starts looking rented. And Lisa is left trying to earn something she thought she already had. Once that happens, romance stops feeling soft and starts feeling procedural. Then came the shopping list, and every item on it made the whole relationship feel less like love and more like a transaction. Once the list comes out, the whole mood changes. Because up until that point, Lisa is dealing with pressure in a vague emotional way. Family approval, spiritual consequences, the fear of losing Daniel, all of that is heavy, but still abstract enough for people to rationalize, still soft enough for. Hope to slip through, still unclear enough for someone in love to tell herself this is only one difficult step on the way to a future together. Then the ritual gets a price tag. Then the demands get itemized. Then the fear stops floating in the air and lands in her wallet. 2 yams, a female goat, cash, not trust, not honesty, not time. Not some private conversation about how this relationship survives. No, now the path forward comes with a shopping list, and the second that happens, the romance starts looking less like devotion and more like a checkout counter. That is why this part matters so much. Money takes pressure and makes it measurable. Money turns sacrifice from a feeling into a receipt. Money exposes what people value when nobody wants to say the quiet part out loud. And Lisa feels that shift immediately. You can hear it in the frustration, in the suspicion, in the way every purchase starts to sting more than the last one. Because she is not entering this part of the story as someone flush with cash and happily funding a symbolic gesture. She is already strained. She is already worried. She is already deep enough into this relationship that every extra cost lands on top of emotional exhaustion. So when the market trip begins, she is not simply running errands for some ritual she fully believes in. She is watching more money leave her hands while the promise of security stays frustratingly out of reach. The yams are the first signal that something ugly is happening. Not because yams themselves matter, but because of how the moment plays out. Lisa wants explanations. She wants some logic. She wants to know why these items are needed and what they even mean. Instead, she gets vague answers, loose justification, and a vibe that she is expected to stop asking questions and keep paying. That is the first reframe. The ritual is not built to increase clarity. It is built to increase compliance. If the meaning is blurry but the payment is exact, that tells you a lot. Then Daniel spends her money with a comfort level that should make anybody pause. He does not act like a man carrying the burden of a sacred process with deep concern for how much this is costing the woman he says he loves. He acts relaxed, casual, loose. He buys at a price that annoys Lisa because from her point of view, every bit of waste matters now. And that moment is not small. It is a receipt. It is evidence. It shows the emotional arrangement in the open. He is handling her money more casually than she is, because the pain of losing it lands on her harder than it lands on him. That is why this is not some harmless little haggling scene. This is one of the clearest windows into the relationship. When a person is spending your money more freely than you are, while you are the one carrying the fear, the debt, and the uncertainty, the issue is no longer poor negotiation. The issue is ownership of consequence. Daniel gets the social ease. Lisa gets the financial anxiety. Daniel gets to move through the market like this is all part of the process. Lisa gets the sinking feeling that she is funding a future she still has not been guaranteed. And then comes the goat, which makes the whole thing feel even harsher. Because now the ritual is not only symbolic, it is visibly expensive. It is tangible. It is awkward. It is impossible to dress up as some tiny formality. A goat is not a candle. A goat is not a small token. A goat is a reminder that this process is demanding resources from a woman who is already worried about how much she has left. So when Lisa gets tense here, she is not being dramatic. She is doing math while her emotions are already running on fumes. She knows the shopping is not over. She knows the priest still expects money. She knows there are more demands ahead. And that is where the deeper dread kicks in, because she starts to realize this is not one payment. This is a chain of payment. That is why the emotional temperature rises so sharply in this section. Lisa is not only nervous about whether the ritual will work, she is starting to grasp that every step toward acceptance comes with another cost attached. Pay for the items, pay for the access, pay for the possibility of forgiveness, pay before you know the outcome. Pay without guarantees. That pattern changes the story. This is no longer spiritual pressure by itself. This is financial extraction wrapped inside emotional desperation. The ritual does not simply ask her to show respect, it asks her to keep proving how much she is willing to spend to avoid losing Daniel. And once you see it that way, the market becomes one of the most revealing parts of the whole story, because it strips away the dramatic smoke and shows the basic structure underneath. Love is no longer being measured through care, patience, or mutual sacrifice. Love is being measured through purchases, through what Lisa will hand over, through how much she will tolerate, through how far she will stretch herself before anybody offers her certainty in return. That is not romantic. That is transactional. And the more Daniel moves through that transaction with ease, the harder it becomes to treat him like some passive bystander caught in tradition. He benefits from her compliance. Even when he is not the top authority in the room, he is still part of the machine collecting the cost. In my opinion, this is the point where the script stops being about strange ritual details and starts becoming brutally simple. Lisa wants reassurance. Everyone around her offers requirements instead. Lisa wants to secure the relationship. The process keeps converting that desire into spending. Lisa wants to feel chosen. Instead, she is being invoiced. That is why the yams matter. That is why the goat matters. That is why the cash matters most of all. Each item sends the same message without ever saying it cleanly. If you want this relationship badly enough, prove it with payment. And the hardest part is this. None of these purchases buy clarity. None of them buy fairness. None of them buy dignity. They only buy passage to the next stage of uncertainty. That is the sting sitting underneath every scene in the market. Lisa is paying forward into a system that keeps moving the finish line. First the list, then the shopping, then the priest, then more cash, then the ritual itself. It never feels like she is arriving anywhere. It feels like she is unlocking the next toll booth, which brings you to the question that this whole section leaves hanging in the air, and it is a brutal one. Because once the process starts asking for yams, a goat, and cash before anyone will even consider whether she can be forgiven, the romance starts looking like a business arrangement with spiritual branding. If the ritual is sincere, why does every step look like a payment gate by this point? The easiest thing in the world would be to sit back and call Lisa foolish, but that would also be the laziest reading possible, because people do not end up in situations like this because they are too stupid to. Notice something is off. They end up here because emotion can make a bad bargain feel like the last bridge standing, and once your heart gets wrapped around a future, once you have spent time, money, pride, and public trust trying to build that future, walking away does not feel clean, it feels like death by admission. That is the psychology sitting under Lisa's choices, and if you miss that, you miss the whole engine of the story. She keeps going because losing Daniel has become bigger in her mind than losing comfort, money, certainty, or even dignity. That is the core of it. When somebody becomes tied to your idea of peace, your judgment starts bending around that fear. You stop asking, is this fair? And start asking, how much more do I need to do so this does not fall apart? You stop measuring the cost honestly because the alternative feels too painful to look at directly. And from where Lisa is standing, the alternative is brutal. If this ritual fails, if the family says no, if the priest says no, if the whole structure closes in on her, then she is forced to face a possibility she clearly cannot bear. That everything she already poured into Daniel might lead nowhere. That is why sunk cost matters here, not as some cold theory, but as an emotional trap people walk into all the time. The more you have already given, the harder it gets to pull back, because pulling back means facing the size of the loss. Lisa has already invested in the trip, the relationship, the fantasy of marriage, the belief that this bond is worth fighting for. And once a person has built that much of their emotional life around a hope for ending, every new sacrifice starts feeling easier to justify than the shame of. Admitting the whole thing may have been a mistake. So she keeps moving forward, not because every new demand makes sense, but because stopping would force her to look backward. And hope is doing a lot of damage here too. Hope sounds innocent, but in the wrong setting, hope can become a drug. It keeps people enduring conditions they would never recommend to anybody else, because they are always one step away from relief, one step away from approval, one step away from being told it was all worth it. That is where Lisa seems trapped. She is chasing a moment of emotional security that always appears to be close enough to touch, and every time it slips away, she is handed another requirement, another explanation, another hurdle that promises the same thing. Keep going, you are almost there. Prove yourself one more time. Pay one more cost. Take one more hit. That cycle can keep people in terrible situations for much longer than logic ever would. And underneath all of that is the oldest ache of all, the need to feel chosen. Not tolerated, not conditionally accepted, not half approved after being corrected, fully chosen. That need makes people vulnerable in ways they do not like to admit. Because once you start tying your worth to whether one person picks you, every obstacle between you and that choice starts feeling personal. Now, it is not only about keeping Daniel, it is about proving she is worth keeping. That is why the process becomes so dangerous psychologically. The ritual is not asking Lisa only for money or obedience. It is pressing on identity, on belonging, on the fear that if she does not comply, she will once again be the one who gets rejected. So no, I do not think the fairest reading is Lisa is weak. Weak is too cheap a word for something this emotionally loaded. She looks invested. She looks scared. She looks like someone trying to defend a future she already paid for in multiple currencies: emotional, financial, social, and private. And once people have paid that much, they do not like to hear that the answer might be to cut their losses. They want a path that redeems the pain. They want proof that all the humiliating parts were leading somewhere meaningful. That does not make Lisa irrational in some cartoon way. It makes her painfully human. A fair-minded person could also say from Lisa's side, this is not humiliation at all. At least not at first. From her point of view, this may look like compromise. It may look like respect for Daniel's family and beliefs. It may look like sacrifice for the person she loves. A lot of people in relationships do things outside their comfort zone because they want to show commitment. They meet the family halfway. They step into customs they do not fully understand. They try to prove good faith. On paper, that can sound mature. That can sound generous. That can sound like love making room for difference. But that logic breaks down the second respect turns one-sided and sacrifice starts swallowing the self. Respect means engaging with someone else's values without being stripped of your own voice. Compromise means both people carry some discomfort. Sacrifice means giving something up for a shared good, not endlessly paying to keep your place in the room. What Lisa is doing starts to drift past all of those softer words. She is not entering a balanced exchange where two people are finding common ground. She is being moved through a process where the burden keeps landing on her, the demands keep growing around her, and the goalpost keeps sitting in someone else's hands. That is not compromise anymore. That is self-erasure wearing the polite mask of devotion. And once a person reaches that stage, they start normalizing things that would have shocked them earlier. They become easier to manage because they are no longer protecting their boundaries first. They are protecting the relationship first. That is the subtle but devastating shift. The question in Lisa's mind is no longer what should never be asked of me. The question becomes, what do I still need to do so I do not lose him? Once that swap happens, all sorts of bad dynamics become easier to sell, because fear does the heavy lifting. Fear of abandonment, fear of embarrassment, fear of being wrong, fear of leaving empty-handed after giving so much already. And Daniel does not need to explain all that to her out loud for it to work. The dynamic itself teaches it. Every step keeps telling her the same message. Approval is conditional. Your future together is fragile. Keep cooperating. Keep spending. Keep submitting. Keep hoping. That is why this section of the story matters so much. It shows why Lisa does not simply stop at the first red flag and walk away. She is too deep in emotionally, and hope keeps whispering that the next step will finally make sense of all the earlier pain. That is the brutal setup for what comes next, because the market was only the warm-up. The money was only one form of pressure, and the emotional bending we have already seen was only the beginning. The worst part had not even started yet. The second Lisa steps into that ritual space, the story changes again, because outside in the market there was still noise, movement, bargaining, the illusion that she was participating in a process, but inside that room, participation starts to disappear and submission takes over. The atmosphere does not invite reflection. It does not calm her down. It does not create trust. It hits her like a wall. The shouting starts early. The rules tighten fast. The energy is aggressive, unpredictable, and strange enough to make anyone unfamiliar with it feel off balance within seconds. Lisa does not walk into that space looking grounded or prepared. She walks in looking like someone who already knows she is out of her depth, and the room seems designed to make sure she feels every inch of that. That is what gives this section its edge. Fear is no longer implied. Fear becomes physical. You can feel it in the silence she is forced into, in the raised voices, in the way the entire setting seems to strip her of any normal social footing. There is no casual conversation here, no easing into the process, no effort to translate the moment in a way that gives her dignity or emotional control. The room is operating on its own terms, and those terms are clear right away. She is there to receive, not to question. She is there to endure, not to understand. She is there to follow cues from people who hold all the authority while she holds all the vulnerability. And that imbalance matters more than any single object in the room. Because the real power of spectacle is not in the visuals alone, it is in what the spectacle does to the mind. When people are flooded emotionally, when the environment feels intense, loud, sacred, hostile, confusing, or all of those things at once, they stop processing with the same clarity they had outside. The body starts working faster than the brain. You become focused on surviving the moment, not analyzing the structure of it. Your goal becomes keeping up, not stepping back. That is why spectacle is so effective in any setting where authority wants obedience. Overwhelm the senses, unsettle the target, control the rhythm, and suddenly resistance feels harder than compliance. Lisa looks caught in exactly that kind of experience. The room does not seem built to help her slow down and think. It seems built to push her into a state where the people in charge set the pace, and she struggles to keep up emotionally. The shouting is part of that. The silence is part of that too. Silence in a moment like this does not create peace. Silence becomes pressure. It tells the person with the least power to hold still, stay quiet, and absorb whatever comes next without interruption. So when Lisa sits there looking shaken, that reaction is not random. It is the predictable effect of a space where she has almost no control over the tone, the meaning, or the next step. And once fear enters the body like that, strange things start becoming easier to accept. This is the point where a person stops asking whether the process is fair and starts asking how to get through it without making things worse. That shift is everything. Because now she is no longer standing outside the ritual comparing it to normal logic. Now she is trapped inside the emotional weather of the room, trying not to offend, trying not to fail, trying not to be the one who ruins her own chance at being accepted. The room does not need to explain itself perfectly once it has already made her feel small. Small people comply faster. Small people hesitate to challenge. Small people start looking to authority for cues on how to survive the moment. In my opinion, this is where the story gets darker than people first realize, because what looks dramatic on camera may also be doing serious psychological work in real time. A raised voice is not only a raised voice in a charged setting, It becomes a signal. It tells you who has command. A sudden rule about silence is not only a ritual detail, it becomes a reminder that your voice is not central here. An unfamiliar action or strange object is not only part of tradition, it becomes one more thing you do not understand while someone else acts with total confidence. Layer enough of those moments together and a person can start feeling foolish, exposed, and dependent all at once. That dependence is where obedience gets easier. Not because Lisa suddenly believes every claim in front of her with full conviction, but because when a person is overwhelmed, certainty matters less than escape. They want the right answer. They want the safe move. They want the path that gets them through the room and out the other side with the least damage. So they follow. They nod. They stay still. They let authority fill the silence. They stop testing the logic of each demand because their nervous system is too busy tracking threat. This is how emotional flooding works. It does not need total belief. It only needs enough fear and confusion to make resistance feel costly. That is why the space itself matters so much in this story. It is not just a backdrop. It acts almost like another character, one that reduces Lisa before anyone even finishes speaking. The setting does part of the work for the people inside it. The sound, the rules, the intensity, the feeling that something larger than her is unfolding around her, all of that pushes her toward a smaller emotional position. And once she is there, the next stages of the ritual land on softer ground. A person who feels centered might push back. A person who feels intimidated starts looking for permission to breathe. The cruel part is that when people later describe these moments, they often focus on the surface details because those are easier to talk about. The shouting, the command, the strange actions, the fear on Lisa's face. But the deeper story is what those details are doing beneath the surface. They are changing her mental state. They are moving her from skepticism into submission, from discomfort into dependence, from confusion into compliance. She is not becoming more informed in that room. She is becoming more manageable. And once someone is in that state, almost any next step can be made to feel urgent, necessary, and bigger than they have the strength to challenge. So by the time the ritual fully starts moving, Lisa is already in the worst possible condition for clear judgment. She is scared, quiet, disoriented, emotionally overloaded, and desperate for this whole thing to end in her favor. That is not a healing state. That is an obedient state, which leaves one question hanging over the whole room, and it is hard to shake once it lands. Was the room meant to heal her? Or to make resistance feel impossible, then the ritual moves into its most invasive phase. Because fear by itself was not enough, money by itself was not enough, silence by itself was not enough. Now the room needs a target, and the target becomes Lisa's past. This is where the shells, the oracle, and the claims of sin stop feeling like strange ritual details and start functioning like a machine for public exposure. The message coming at Lisa is brutal in its effect. What happened in your life before this room is no longer yours alone. Your history is now evidence. Your past is now a case file. Your private mess is now something other people can hold up, examine, and turn into a verdict. That is why this section hits harder than the market and harder than the entrance. Up to this point, Lisa has been spending money and absorbing pressure, but now the process reaches inside her personal life and turns it into material. Her relationships, her marriages, her sexuality, the fact that her divorce is not yet final, all of it gets pulled into the ritual and treated not as context, not as human complexity, but as proof of wrongdoing. That is a major shift. Once your past gets converted into an accusation inside a room where you already have the least power, your ability to defend yourself drops even further. You are no longer only anxious about what is happening. You are now exposed. And exposure in front of authority changes everything, because people can endure a lot in private that they cannot endure once shame gets attached to it in public. Shame is heavier than fear in one important way. Fear tells you something bad might happen. Shame tells you that something bad is already inside you, visible to other people, waiting to be judged. That is why the oracle and the shells matter so much in the structure of the scene. Whether one sees those acts as spiritual, symbolic, or theatrical is not the point here. The point is what those acts allow the room to do. They give authority a stage on which private pain can be reframed as moral failure. And once that starts, Lisa is placed in an almost impossible position. If she resists, she risks looking guilty, disrespectful, or uncooperative in a space already tilted against her. If she stays quiet, the accusations settle over her without challenge. If she tries to explain herself, she is still explaining herself inside a system that already appears to have decided the meaning of her past. That is the trap. The room does not need to know her fully. It only needs enough of her history to turn her into the example of what needs correction. In my opinion, this is where people should pay close attention to the structure instead of getting lost in whether they personally agree with any belief involved. Because the sharp issue is not mocking faith or custom. The sharp issue is how easily a person's most vulnerable history can be turned into leverage once authority takes hold of the narrative. Lisa's unfinished divorce is not treated as a legal detail needing resolution. It becomes part of the moral charge against her. Her past relationships are not treated as lived experience with nuance or pain or context. They become signs of offense. Once that happens, the conversation is no longer about understanding her. It is about positioning her beneath judgment. And that public positioning is incredibly powerful, because after someone has been named as the source of the problem, every next demand starts sounding more reasonable to the people in the room. Of course she has to prove herself. Of course she has to submit to the process. Of course she has to accept the terms. The shame does half the work before the next command is even spoken. That is how private pain becomes public leverage. It softens resistance. It narrows options. It makes the accused person more eager to repair the image being built around them, even if the repair comes at a terrible cost. Lisa's reaction shows how disorienting this is. She does not seem grounded enough in the moment to push back against the framing itself, because the room has already built too much momentum. The fear is there. The silence is there. The authority is there. Now shame joins them. And shame is often the final ingredient needed to make people cooperate. Once someone feels morally exposed in front of others, they start chasing relief. They want the stain lifted. They want the room to soften. They want the authority figures to stop looking at them like the problem. That desire can make almost any next step feel worth taking. And this is where the story gets nastier than a simple recap will ever capture. Because once Lisa's past is dragged into the room this way, the ritual is no longer only about blessing a future relationship. It is now about controlling the terms under which she gets to remain in it. Her acceptance is no longer based on love alone. It is tied to whether she will submit after being morally cornered. That makes every later promise, vow, and payment feel heavier, because they are not happening in a vacuum. They are happening after she has already been made to feel like she needs fixing. A fair person can still say Lisa chose to stay in that room, and yes, technically she did, but choice under this kind of pressure is not simple. When somebody is scared, outnumbered, emotionally invested, and now publicly shamed, they do not think with the same freedom they had outside. They start thinking about recovery, not principle. They start looking for the move that gets them out from under the judgment. They start accepting terms that might have sounded absurd an hour earlier because the emotional pain of the room has changed the scale of what feels unbearable. That is why this section matters so much. It shows the exact point where the ritual stops being about mystery and starts being about leverage. The shells land. The oracle speaks. The room identifies a sinner. Lisa's past becomes the evidence. Her private life becomes public material. And once shame enters a space already loaded with pressure, people do things to escape it. They nod at demands they do not fully understand. They accept labels they would reject elsewhere. They reach for forgiveness from people who first had to make them feel dirty enough to need it. Once shame enters the room, people start agreeing to things they would reject outside the room. Then comes one of the most revealing moments in the entire story. Because after all the fear, all the noise, all the moral pressure, the ritual stops circling around the cost and names it directly. Cash. More cash. Not closure, not compassion, not some quiet sign that the hardest emotional part is over. Money again. And the second that demand lands, the whole atmosphere shifts from dread into something even uglier. Because now the people inside this setup stop looking like fixed roles in a sacred process and start looking like players inside a chain of extraction where every person is trying to protect their own gain. This is where the irony turns sharp, and Daniel cannot hide inside the background anymore. Earlier, he was loose with Lisa's money. Earlier, he moved through the market with the kind of ease people usually have when the consequences are not hitting their own chest. He could buy, spend, wave things through, and keep the process moving because the money leaving Lisa's side still served his interest. But now the priest wants cash in front of everyone, and suddenly Daniel's body language changes. Suddenly there's hesitation. Suddenly there is reluctance. Suddenly the man who had no problem helping Lisa spend starts acting careful when somebody else is reaching for the same pocket. That moment is gold, because it exposes the arrangement without needing anybody to confess a thing. Daniel does not have to say, "I was fine with this when I thought the money stayed in our lane." The scene says it for him. He looks less like a devoted partner helping the woman he loves through a difficult ritual, and more like a man who has discovered the supply chain is bigger than he thought. The hand that was comfortable moving her money around gets tight the second another authority figure puts out his own hand. That is not a random pause. That is a receipt. And Lisa, in the middle of all this, does something heartbreaking. She pushes forward. She does not use Daniel's hesitation as a wake-up call. She does not suddenly stop and ask the obvious question, why does this keep turning into a cash machine? She doubles down because by now she is too emotionally deep to risk a refusal. That is what makes the scene bitter instead of merely absurd. The person losing the most is the one working hardest to keep the process alive. Daniel hesitates because his comfort is being touched. Lisa pushes because her future feels like it is hanging by a thread. Same money, different panic. In my opinion, this is the exact midpoint where the story stops being about one manipulative dynamic and starts revealing the whole pyramid underneath it. Lisa is under Daniel. Daniel is under the priest. The priest says he is under the gods. Everyone points upward to justify why they are asking for more, but the actual cost keeps falling in one direction only. Downward, toward the person with the least authority and the most desperation. That is the design. The uncle invokes tradition. The elders authorize seriousness. The priest invokes the oracle. The gods become the final invisible source no one in the room is really allowed to challenge. By the time the bill reaches Lisa, it no longer sounds like a human demand at all. It sounds ordained, which is convenient for everybody collecting from her. That is why this section should make people angry. Not only because the priest asks for money, but because the structure protects the ask from ordinary scrutiny. If Daniel wanted cash from Lisa for himself, that would look obvious. If the priest wanted cash in a normal transaction, people might weigh the terms more clearly. But place the money inside ritual, shame, fear, and authority, and now the demand arrives wearing moral pressure. Now refusing sounds risky. Now hesitating sounds disrespectful. Now paying sounds like the only responsible move left. The system does not only ask for money. It corners people emotionally until payment starts looking like proof of sincerity. And Daniel's discomfort makes the whole thing even more revealing because it cracks his role open. Up to this point, he has benefited from Lisa's willingness to spend, travel, comply, and keep chasing approval, but when the priest takes his slice, Daniel is forced into a smaller version of Lisa's own position. Someone above him now controls the next step. Someone above him now decides what must be handed over. Someone above him now turns his wishes into a cost. It is a nasty little mirror. For one moment, the man helping manage Lisa is being managed too. And instead of making the whole structure look noble, that hesitation makes it look greedier. Everyone is in the chain for a reason. Everyone has a stake. Everyone is protecting something. Lisa, though, remains the one carrying the emotional burden of failure, which is why she keeps pushing the money forward. From her side, this is not about generosity. This is not even about belief anymore. This is about survival of the relationship. She has already been judged, frightened, exposed, and stretched financially. Stopping now would mean all of that pain might lead nowhere. And once somebody reaches that state, they will often do the one thing that makes the least sense from the outside. They will pay more to avoid finding out they should have stopped earlier. That is the true cruelty of this moment. The system does not only take from her wallet, it uses the fear of loss to make her volunteer for the next hit. So the scene ends up carrying two truths at once. On one level, it is darkly funny. The man spending her money with swagger suddenly turns cautious when another man wants his own share. There is bitter comedy in that. But on a deeper level, it is grim because it shows how opportunism stacks. Daniel is not the final boss here. He is one rung in a ladder. The priest is not the final boss either. He points upward too. Every layer borrows power from the one above it and passes the weight downward until Lisa is left financing a process that keeps calling itself necessary. And the ugliest part is that even this was not the real point of no return. As bad as the money demand looks, as revealing as Daniel's hesitation is, as obvious as the pyramid becomes in this moment, the ceremony still was not the real lock. The real lock came next. Then the ritual reaches the part that matters more than the shouting, more than the money, and more than the spectacle. Because this is the point where the process stops asking Lisa to endure a scene and starts asking her to surrender her future in words she cannot easily take back. The statues come out, and with them, the whole atmosphere changes. Up to now, the pressure has been loud, public, and chaotic. Now it gets close, personal, focused. And that shift is what makes this part so unsettling. Because control is often strongest when it stops yelling and starts sounding intimate. A promise inside a charged space does not land like a normal promise. It lands heavier. It lands deeper. Lisa is no longer only being told she needs cleansing. She is being asked to attach herself to Daniel in a total way, to say with her own mouth that from this point on, he will be the only person in her life, no one else, no man, no woman, no alternative, no future, beyond the one being placed in front of her right there in that room. That is not a minor ritual phrase. That is the emotional center of the entire story. Because once those words enter the scene, this stops looking like forgiveness and starts looking like ownership. And the statues matter because they turn the whole thing into something tangible. A vow floating in the air is one thing. A vow placed into an object, held, kissed, repeated, pressed into the body through ritual gesture, that hits differently. It makes the moment feel sealed. It gives the room a physical anchor for the promise. It makes the pressure harder to shrug off later because the body remembers these things better than people admit. The object in the hand, the voice speaking, the eyes watching, the command to repeat, the sense that something larger is witnessing it all, that combination can plant itself in the mind with frightening force. This is where my discomfort with the whole process spikes most, because a person who is calm, informed, and secure can make a promise with agency. Lisa is none of those things here. She has already been frightened, judged, exposed, and financially squeezed. She has been pushed through shame and uncertainty. She is standing inside a room where authority has been stacked against her from every direction. So when she repeats this vow, it is impossible to treat it like some clean expression of free choice, because choice under pressure changes shape. It starts sounding like consent while feeling more like surrender. And then comes the darker layer. The promise is not offered as a hopeful commitment only. It comes tied to a warning. If she fails, if she strays, if she misbehaves, there is an implied consequence hanging over her. Not only disappointment, not only relationship fallout, but something bigger and scarier. The suggestion that unseen forces will come after her. That is where the scene crosses the line for me from intense into invasive. The ritual is no longer saying prove your love, it is saying bind yourself, and fear what happens if you ever break from the role we are assigning you. That kind of fear does not need to make perfect logical sense to do damage. It only needs to lodge itself in the mind of someone already overwhelmed. And Lisa is the ideal target for that kind of imprint in this moment, because she has been worn down enough that relief is already starting to feel close. Once someone believes the end of the ordeal is near, they become even more likely to agree to the final condition. They tell themselves this is the last thing. One more step. One more sentence, one more performance of loyalty, then the room will soften. Then the danger will pass, then the future will be safe again. That is how people end up agreeing to terms they might never accept in ordinary life. A fair person might say vows are normal in relationships. Fine, they are. Commitment is normal. Promising exclusivity is normal. But context decides meaning. And this context is rotten. A private promise made between two people with equal footing is not the same as a ritualized pledge extracted from someone after fear, shame, and pressure have already narrowed their choices. One can be intimacy. The other can become control. And what makes this scene so difficult to ignore is how thoroughly the control element has been built before the vow even arrived. By the time Lisa gets to this point, the room has already done most of the work. It has made her small. It has made her anxious. It has made her hungry for approval. The vow simply gives that emotional state a permanent shape. That is why the pacing here matters. The room does not need to rush now. The trap works better when it slows down and feels solemn. The loud pressure of earlier scenes gives way to something tighter, more personal, more binding. Lisa is being folded into a script that sounds like devotion, but carries the logic of possession. Not because love itself is the problem, but because this vow is being framed as the price of continued acceptance. And once acceptance gets tied to a promise backed by fear, people stop thinking about whether the promise is fair. They focus on making sure they do not trigger the punishment attached to breaking it. Daniel's role in this moment matters too, because even when he is not the loudest authority in the room, he is still the person who benefits most from Lisa internalizing this lock. He does not have to threaten her directly. The ritual does that work around him. He does not have to argue for total loyalty in plain language. The room stages it for him, sanctifies it for him, and places it into Lisa's own mouth. That is part of what makes the whole thing feel so cold. The process launders control through ritual, then hands the result back as if it were sacred, loving, and earned. So when people look at this scene and think the hard part is the yelling or the money, I think they are missing where the deepest damage lands. The hardest part is here, in the moment Lisa is pushed to make her future smaller than it was before, than to treat that shrinking as proof of commitment. She believes the worst is behind her because the room is finally giving her a path toward relief. But the truth is harsher. The shouting was temporary. The spending was temporary. Even the shame of exposure was temporary. This promise is the part that sticks. Lisa thinks the hard part is over. In truth, this is the moment the trap becomes permanent in her mind. Then, after all of that, the room gives Lisa what she has been chasing from the moment this ordeal began. Approval, release, a way out. The cleansing is declared complete, and suddenly the whole machine that frightened her, judged her, drained her, and made her feel small gets to present itself as the solution. That is where the tragic irony lands hardest, because nothing about the path was gentle, nothing about the process was balanced, and yet the ending is staged as if a burden has been lifted from her. Lisa walks away relieved, even grateful, and the audience is left with a much uglier feeling, because what she is calling peace looks a lot like the emotional exhaustion of someone who finally got permission to stop being under attack. And that is why this ending should not feel comforting, even though Lisa feels comforted. The same structure that built the fear now gets credit for removing it. The same authority that pushed her into shame now gets to announce she is clean. The same room that demanded silence now gets to define the meaning of what just happened. The same process that kept moving the goalpost now gets to act like it delivered a clean resolution. That is not closure in a normal sense. That is a pressure system rewarding compliance, then dressing the result up as healing. Every earlier thread folds back into this moment. The cash was not random. It helped buy passage to this declaration. The fear was not random. It softened her into the kind of person who would accept this declaration with relief. The uncle was not random. He helped move the relationship out of private hands and into a chain of approval where Lisa had almost no leverage. The pressure was not random. It trained her to see surrender as progress. The promise was not random. It made the outcome feel binding, not only relieving. Even the silence matters now. Because once someone has been forced to hold back their voice long enough, being told the ordeal is over can feel like mercy even if they were never treated with care in the first place. That is what makes the whole scene work so well on a psychological level. It takes a person to the edge of uncertainty, then hands them the smallest piece of certainty and lets that feel enormous. Lisa is not celebrating because everything suddenly became fair. She is celebrating because the threat seems to have lifted. She is not glowing because her dignity has been restored. She is glowing because the room has stopped pressing on her. That difference matters. Relief is not proof that the process was healthy. Relief often means the pressure finally paused. And in my opinion, this is the point where the story becomes hardest to watch if you have been following the emotional pattern from the start. Because Lisa is now treating survival as success. She came in terrified of losing Daniel. She went through fear, money, shame, commands, and vows. She made herself smaller in front of people who had the power to reject her. Then, when they chose not to reject her, the emotional reward was so strong that it blurred everything that had just happened. That is how these situations keep their grip on people. The relief at the end can be so intense that it rewrites the memory of the pain that got you there. So when Lisa leaves happy, the audience should feel the opposite of reassured. Not because she does not deserve peace, she does, but because this version of peace came on terms that should make anyone pause. All roads in this story led to one result. Comply, pay, endure, submit, promise, and then you get welcomed back into the future you were afraid to lose. That is the formula. Not mutual understanding, not equal sacrifice, not a relationship repairing itself through honesty, a sequence of pressure ending in approval. Once you see that, the happy face at the end starts looking less like triumph and more like proof that the system did exactly what it was built to do. And then Daniel changes fast. That part should not be missed because his energy shifts almost immediately once the relationship has been cleared for takeoff again. The uncertainty fades and suddenly warmth returns. Reassurance returns. The future comes back into view. The man who benefited from Lisa's fear now gets to enjoy her relief too. He is affectionate again, hopeful again. The relationship feels alive again. Not because the deeper issues were resolved, but because the barrier blocking the shared fantasy has been removed. That speed tells its own story. Once the approval is restored, Daniel does not seem weighed down by the same tension anymore. His mood lifts because the road ahead looks open again. And that is where the unease sharpens one last time. Because future planning comes back into the conversation almost as if nothing corrosive happened on the road to get there. The costs disappear into the background. The fear disappears into the background. The strange rules, the money, the public judgment, the pressure to submit, all of it gets folded into one clean emotional conclusion. We made it. We can move forward now. But the audience has seen too much to take that line at face value. We know what the road looked like. We know who carried the burden of it. We know who was asked to prove the most. So when Daniel starts warming up again, talking like the future is bright again, acting as if the relationship is back on safe ground again, the moment lands with a sting. Because from Lisa's side, this renewed warmth probably feels like a reward. After all the pressure, here's the version of Daniel she wanted back. The loving version. The reassuring version. The version that makes all the sacrifice feel as if it led somewhere. But from the outside, it lands differently. It feels conditional. It feels too neatly timed. It feels like approval restored the relationship's glow in the exact same moment it restored Daniel's comfort. That is why the ending is so uneasy. Lisa leaves thinking something sacred has repaired her path. The audience leaves knowing the path only reopened because she gave the room exactly what it wanted. And once the relationship is approved again, Daniel's energy changes so fast that the next question almost asks itself. What happens now that he has her back where he wants her? Lisa left relieved for the same reason people stay too long in situations that wear them down. Because once fear becomes constant, the end of pressure can feel like love even when love was never what caused the relief in the first place. That is the contradiction this whole story has been building toward, and it is why the ending lands with such a bad taste. She did not walk out of that space stronger. She did not walk out with more clarity, more equality, or more proof that this relationship had suddenly become healthy. She walked out with the one thing she had been begging for from the start, reassurance that she had not lost Daniel. After everything that happened, that single emotional reward was enough to make the whole ordeal feel worth surviving. And that is the tragedy sitting under every smile in the final moment. Because if you pull the camera back and look at the pattern, nothing at the center of the relationship was repaired. The cleanse did not create trust. It did not erase the imbalance. It did not answer the uglier questions hanging over Daniel's intentions. It did not make the pressure from family disappear. It did not turn money into a side issue. It did not undo the humiliation, the fear, the silence, the shaming, or the way Lisa's private life got turned into public leverage. None of that was fixed. What changed was simpler and sadder. The people with power over her future told her she had done enough for now. That is why she looked relieved. Not because the relationship became safe, but because the threat of losing it had been postponed. And once you see that, every open loop in this story starts closing at once. Why did she accept demands that made so little sense to her? Because the alternative felt worse. Why did the shopping list matter so much? Because each purchase made the relationship feel less like love and more like a toll road she had already spent too much to leave. Why did the room work on her so completely? Because fear changes what people can challenge in the moment. Why did the exposure of her past hit so hard? Because shame makes people hungry for absolution from the same people wounding them. Why did the vow matter more than the shouting? Because fear fades faster than a promise somebody has been pressured into making. Why did Daniel's warmth return so fast? Because once the approval came back, the future he wanted came back with it. Each piece points to the same ugly truth. The cleanse was never the cure for the real problem. It was a test of how much Lisa would endure to keep chasing the relationship. That is why I keep coming back to the difference between relief and resolution. Lisa got relief. She did not get resolution. Relief says the immediate danger has eased. Resolution says the deeper issue has been addressed. Those are not the same thing, and confusing them is where people get trapped. If someone is drowning emotionally, they will often grab the first floating thing in reach and call it salvation. But staying afloat for a few more minutes is not the same as being brought to shore. That is what this ending feels like. Lisa is floating. She is grateful. She is breathing again. But she is still inside the same water. And to be fair, that does not make her ridiculous. It makes her human in a way people often hate recognizing in themselves. Most people do not walk away the first time something feels wrong. They explain it. They soften it. They compare it to the pain of starting over. They tell themselves one more sacrifice will settle things. One more compromise will prove commitment. One more hard moment will finally lead to peace. Lisa followed that logic all the way through the market, the money, the room, the shame, and the vow. Because by then, she was not choosing between a perfect future and a bad one. She was choosing between the hope she had already invested in and the pain of admitting it might never become what she wanted. Hope won. Hope often does, even when hope is the thing making people easier to control. That is what makes the ending feel ugly even when everyone is smiling. The smiles invite you to read the scene as closure, but the structure of everything before it tells a different story. The uncle, the elders, the priest, the oracle, the demands, the spending, the fear, the exposure, the promise, every road led Lisa to a single emotional conclusion. If you want to keep this man, you will have to accept terms that keep shrinking your own ground. And she did accept them. Not because she was too foolish to notice the cost, but because losing Daniel had become more frightening than paying it. That is not romance. That is fear steering devotion until devotion no longer looks voluntary. So the final contradiction is not a contradiction at all once you strip it down. Lisa left relieved because the cleanse gave her permission to keep believing. It gave her permission to avoid the one thought she had been fighting all along, that the relationship itself might be the thing breaking her down. The ritual did not solve the core issue. It proved how far she was willing to go to avoid facing it. That is why the ending feels so bitter. She thinks she has been restored. The audience can see she has only been folded back into the same dynamic with fresh approval stamped on top. And that is the lasting sting of the whole episode. Everybody in the setup gets something. The family gets compliance. The ritual gets its authority confirmed. Daniel gets the relationship back on track. Lisa gets relief. But relief is the smallest reward of all if the price is your voice, your money, your pride, and your ability to tell the difference between being loved and being managed. That is why this story sticks. Not because it was strange, not because it was loud, because it showed, in the bluntest possible way, how a person can go through something harsh, walk out smiling, and still be deeper in the trap than when they walked in.